The Jets have addressed some key areas this offseason, but the team still has plenty of needs. Let's identify the biggest Jets needs and potential solutions for them today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Thursday, March 20th, 2025, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thank you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. And a big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Well, we're about a week and a half into free agency. The Jets addressed some of their needs in free agency. They got quarterback Justin Fields. They replaced DJ Reed at corner with Brandon Stevens. Andre Sisco signed to help upgrade the safety position. But this is still a team with plenty of needs remaining. And on today's show, we're going to talk about what those needs are and talk about what viable options they may have to address these needs. Now, I think we knew heading into this offseason that this was going to be different from how we saw the Jets operate in 2023 and 2024. The last 2 years after the Aaron Rodgers trade, the Jets, for better or worse, and frankly, it's more for worse, have been all in. They've tried to address every single need because they felt they had a short Super Bowl window. And, as we now know, they've never really had a Super Bowl window. But this Jets offseason is different. You have a first-year head coach, a first-year GM. These guys in situations like that typically take a longer term view. And the Jets also need to kind of clear out their cap situation. They were very tight up against the cap the last couple of years, so they've had to borrow cap space. I mean, right now, and this does not even include some of the other moves that are coming. The Jets have $37.1 million at this moment dedicated in dead money. That's because they have $8.3 million going to Devontae Adams against their cap, $5.9 million going for Tyler Conklin, $5.8 million for Mike Williams, $5.8 million for Tyron Smith, $4.6 million for DJ Reed, $4.4 million for Javon Kinlaw, and then a little bit of money for Wes Schweitzer, Hassan Reddick, Solomon Thomas, and Izzy Abanikanda. So Jets currently $37.1 million in dead money. And that number will go up on June 1st when Aaron Rodgers and CJ Mosley's cuts officially hit the cap. So we're talking about a Jets team that's going to have over $50 million in dead money this offseason. And that's $50 million that could be spent to upgrade the roster otherwise. And, we knew this going in. We knew that the Jets, in order to try and win in 2023 and 2024, were going to hurt their prospects for 2025. The hope was that they'd actually win enough in 2023 and 2024 to make it worth it. And obviously that did not happen. So the Jets can't really fix all of their holes this offseason, but there are some key holes that still can be addressed. And you kind of have to prioritize what you want to address. I think the top thing to try and address right now is the wide receiver position. And I'm not going to lie, when you get to this second week of the offseason, there are not a lot of great options on paper. If you're going to address it in free agency, any position, you kind of just have to take a calculated gamble and hope things work out, or you have to look to the draft. The Jets right now have a legitimately good number one receiver in Garrett Wilson. He's been a 1,000-yard guy all 3 years in the league. And I think that once we get past the draft, now look, I think contract extensions can wait till after the draft because, Garrett Wilson's not going anywhere. So Garrett Wilson's going to be happy to take a new contract after the draft if he wants to stay in New York. Right now, your focus should be on, trying to figure out what's left in free agency and focus on building your draft strategy. After the draft, I think the Jets should make a lucrative extension offer to Garrett Wilson, keep him on the team for years going forward. I think it would be an important thing to do to show that the Jets can keep quality players on this roster. But after Garrett Wilson, the quality falls off quite a bit. I mean, right now, the number 2 receiver is Allen Lazard. And Allen Lazard has never been a quality number 2 receiver. And the last 2 years, he really hasn't looked like a guy who belongs in the league. And he's on a contract the Jets signed 2 years ago, which was a bad contract. I think it was a contract done to try and make Aaron Rodgers happy. And it may have made Aaron Rodgers happy, but it has not made Jets fans happy because Lazard has been one of the bigger free agent busts in recent memory. And then once you get past Lazard, you have Xavier Gipson, who, look, you give Xavier Gipson credit. It was an undrafted free agent who stuck on an NFL roster a couple of years. He'll always have that one moment, his first game as a rookie, when he won the game with a punt return touchdown against the Buffalo Bills. But, Xavier Gipson really did not take much of a leap from year one to year two. And if there wasn't much improvement from year one to year two, it's difficult to expect there to be much improvement from year two to year three. Some guys surprise us. Some guys, have an unusual trajectory, but I think anything you get now from Xavier Gipson would be more of a bonus than quality, than expected quality. And then you have Malachi Corley, who the Jets traded up for in the third round last year, who, if we're being honest, is just like a total wild card. He's a guy who, if he pans out again, great. But I almost feel like if you didn't have Isaiah Davis or Braylon Allen on this roster, I think you would look at putting Corley at running back, because that's kind of like what he was like running back in college, and they kind of stuck him out wide at wide receiver and threw him a bunch of screens. So he wasn't really running routes. He was just kind of making plays with the ball in his hands and running through tackles. Corley's got a long way to go. So what's left for the Jets out there? And the truth is, there aren't many good options in free agency. In fact, I really only see two guys that would intrigue me at all. One would be Amari Cooper, who's coming off kind of a difficult year, but I feel like Amari Cooper is the guy who has the profile of a receiver who would age reasonably well, because his game has really been about precise route running. And one of the things I always look at just to try and figure out how players will age is how much of their game is based on just being incredibly athletic, incredibly fast, and how much of their game is about the technique. Everybody ages and everybody declines with age. But the guys who rely on technique tend to age better, because you can execute good technique at any age. Now, eventually your athletic skills do diminish to the point where even good technique's not enough, but it's a more gradual slide, because you're not leaning on it. You're leaning on it to a degree, but you're not leaning on it as much. And Amari Cooper's always been a very polished route runner. In fact, 3 years ago, I still don't understand why the Jets did not make a trade for him when he was available for a late round draft pick, when the Cowboys were just trying a salary dump. And I think that may have made a difference for the Jets in 2022, 2023, 2024, coming off a difficult year, but was in the situation, started the year in a chaotic situation in Cleveland, and then was traded to the Buffalo Bills and never really developed good chemistry with Josh Allen. Now, Cooper's on the wrong side of 30. It's always a dangerous point to be at as a player, but I think maybe it's a situation where he was just in a bad spot in Cleveland, and then midseason trades can be difficult to navigate. So maybe he's an option. The other option in free agency, I think, would be Keenan Allen, who I'm not crazy about it, because he's in the mid 30s now. He's been a really good receiver for a long time. If you could go back in time, I think in 2013 you would have drafted Keenan Allen over Brian Winters if you were the Jets, even though Winters ended up starting for the team a couple of years. Still, had a decent season with Chicago, but clearly a guy on the downswing. But, is he a guy you could maybe squeeze one more year out of? That's an open question. Stephon Diggs, I'd stay away from. Stephon Diggs is a guy who's shown himself to, be a tough guy in the locker room. I think in a different scenario, I think the Jets of the last 2 years, when you had a veteran-laden team and you were trying to make a run at a championship right then and there, for the Jets of 2023, 2024, Stephon Diggs might be a fit for a first-year head coach, first-year general manager who are trying to win games, but more importantly, trying to build something for the long run. I'm not sure Stephon Diggs is the guy you really want in your locker room year one. And then in the draft at 7, Ted McMillan out of Arizona could be there. Ted McMillan's, a bigger body type receiver. He's in many ways a good complement to Garrett Wilson, as skeptical as I am of the idea of like receiver compliments. He brings things to the table with his size that Garrett Wilson does not, because Garrett Wilson is on the smaller. I would say Garrett Wilson's like small, but he's on the smaller side for receivers. McMillan, a good back shoulder type receiver. That's what Justin Fields is looking for. McMillan would be the best, probably the top option for the Jets if you're looking for real quality. But I think that, I think it's going to be tough to fill this spot, because every good receiver typically has a team. Teams don't let good receivers go. So if we're going to be honest, this is not going to be an easy spot to fill for the New York Jets. But, I think those are really the only viable options that I see at the moment. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll turn our attention to the offensive line. Jets have made a few signings there. And the Jets, I guess, conceivably have a couple different alignments that could work out, but I still think the right tackle spot needs an upgrade. Let's look at the options there as we continue here on this Thursday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Upwork. Scaling your business requires the right expertise at the right time. And with Upwork, you can find specialized freelancers in marketing, development, design, and more. Experts ready to help you take your business to the next level. Upwork gives businesses flexibility by connecting them with top freelance talent across multiple industries, including IT, AI, web development, and marketing. Whether you need extra hands for a project or a long-term partner, Upwork makes hiring simple and affordable. If you need help with a marketing campaign, Upwork can connect you with a freelance expert who delivers incredible results. Posting a job is free and simple, and within a day, multiple qualified candidates you'll have to choose from. Instead of hiring full-time, Upwork helps find affordable, top-tier freelancers to scale a business effectively. Visit Upwork.com right now and post your job for free. That's UPWORK.com, Upwork.com, to connect with top talent and grow your business today. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is also brought to you by Game Time. Imagine watching your favorite team live, feeling the energy of the crowd, and witnessing unforgettable moments. Well, there's nothing like experiencing a big game in person. Getting tickets should not be stressful. That's where Game Time comes in, making it easier than ever to grab last-minute seats at unbeatable prices. Curation makes it easier to find better value for tickets to sports, comedy, theater, and more. You can check the Game Time app, and there are amazing deals on huge matchups coming up. The lowest price guarantee, Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference if they don't have the lowest price. And with seat views before you buy, no surprise fees, and a lowest price guarantee, you can book with total confidence. I've used Game Time myself on plenty of occasions, found last minute tickets at great prices. And again, that view from your seat's really important. You know, there's no surprises, no obstructed views when you arrive. You know exactly what you're getting into with Game Time. So download the Game Time app today, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. That's LOCKEDONNFL, one word with no space, for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. A big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. On today's show, we're taking a look at the biggest holes the Jets have remaining. Jets have made some moves in free agency, but unfortunately, their resources this year are somewhat limited. So, they have to prioritize along the way. And quite frankly, they're going to have to hit on some lower level moves. They're going to have to hit on some moves in the second and third wave of free agency, because the Jets can't really afford to pay top dollar prices this offseason based on the way they've conducted the last 2 years. Now, right tackle is a tough spot right now for the New York Jets. And right tackle is just one of those positions in today's NFL where it's tough to find somebody. I don't know if the word crisis is the right way to put it, but there's a challenge in the NFL finding quality offensive linemen. And this goes back to the way they're coached in college these days, because lots of college offenses are based on the screen game. And the reason college offenses are based on the screen game is that they, in the NCAA, there are different rules than in the NFL on what constitutes an ineligible man downfield. In the NFL, an offensive lineman on a passing play can only go 1 yard downfield. If he goes further, he's considered an ineligible receiver downfield. In college, that's 3 yards. So it's 3 yards in college versus 1 yard in the NFL. And if you can go 3 yards down the field and still be legal in college, that makes the screen game much easier to run, because your lineman can afford to be much more mobile in getting out to block on screens. And that's a lot of different screen concepts, especially using your wide receivers throwing the ball out wide, because your offensive lineman can move much further. And this means that you don't have as many natural pass sets where the quarterback's just dropping back. So you don't get as many reps as a pass blocker, a traditional pass blocker in college football. And that's why you see in the NFL these days, sometimes guys struggle as offensive linemen until maybe year 3, 4, 5 in the league, because it takes them that long to get enough reps to get comfortable doing natural pass sets. So I think that these things are all connected. And all of this means that there usually are not a lot of great offensive linemen available in free agency. And if there is one, it usually costs a lot of money. And most teams won't even let their good offensive linemen go, because they're very difficult to replace. So we're talking about who the Jets could potentially get on the offensive line. There really aren't many great options in free agency. I mean, the one guy I've mentioned a couple times on the show is Jedrick Wills, who was a former first-round pick of the Cleveland Browns, a guy you may remember going back to 2020, because he was a guy we talked about the Jets potentially picking that year. They ended up picking Mekhi Becton. I know Wills actually wasn't on the board by the time the Jets had it. Wills has kind of struggled with injuries. So, there's that risk. And I think, after what you went through with Tyron Smith and Dwayne Brown the last couple of years, I can understand why people might be a little hesitant to go with a guy with injuries. Will's also had a bad year, but, this Cleveland team, I've said this about the Jets, and I've also said this about the Jacksonville Jaguars. Sometimes the situation just gets so chaotic that it drags players' performances down, even otherwise decent players. Wills has not been spectacular. Look, he hasn't lived up to his draft pedigree, but he has had good moments in the league. So, part of me wonders, now these couple of years into the league, as I mentioned, it takes some time to develop in the right spot. Would he be worth a low cost contract? I think you could make an argument that he would be. The other option, this is not an option that really I would be thrilled with. And I'll explain why I wouldn't be thrilled with it. But there is a guy available who's been a quality player in the league for a long time, actually a former Jet. That's Kelvin Beachum. Kelvin Beachum been with Arizona, coming off a decent season. Now a right tackle, now going to be 36 years old. And that's the reason I'm not crazy about it. Because, again, I don't love the idea of trying to squeeze out another year from a tackle in his mid to late 30s. I feel like we've been there, done that with Dwayne Brown. And, it doesn't always work out that well. But in lieu of many other quality options, maybe that's a guy you look to. Because right now, the way the Jets are currently constituted, there really would only be one of two options in how to come up with their offensive line. One would be to put Chukwuma Okorafor, who they just signed from New England, at right tackle. And the problem with that is last 2 years he's been benched. And last year he only played 12 snaps and pretty much left the team. So you really want to depend on that guy. I mean, I didn't mind the signing. I think he actually is a decent depth signing. But he was benched after 12 plays last year. And the year before that, he was benched in Pittsburgh for Broderick Jones. But a guy with starting experience. The other option would be, and I think that the second option I like even less, would be put Josh Myers, an experienced starter at center, and move Joe Tippmann out to right guard, which is where he played some his rookie season, and then you move Elijah Vera Tucker out to right tackle. Now, I really don't like that idea, because you're taking two guys who have found a home. You took Joe Tippmann, who was a good center last year, and Elijah Vera Tucker, who for the first time in his career feels like he's finally found a permanent home and stayed healthy and had a good season. And you're moving them both off the positions where they succeeded last year. I mean, that really I don't love. The other option, and this is probably the most viable option, would be to look to the draft. And look, the Jets can only address one position at 7. But, would tackle be the position they address? I think that's a possibility. Will Campbell out of LSU is the guy generating the most buzz. Campbell is viewed as kind of like the top prospect in the draft at the tackle position. And there hasn't been a whole lot of buzz with him to the Jets. But if the Jets are looking for a tackle, he could be an option. Another guy who's actually starting to get some buzz is Armand Membu out of Missouri. Actually, there was a recent mock draft that sent Membu to the Jets, and he's starting to rise up draft boards. And we'll talk a lot more about him in the days and weeks ahead. What I like about him, though, is first of all, he got into the starting lineup as a freshman. That was part because of injuries, but he got into the starting lineup as a freshman. His second year, his sophomore year, he was a semifinalist for an award. So he is a decent. So I always look at how young does a guy start producing, because, and this is the way I look at it. People say well, age shouldn't matter in a draft prospect. I don't know that I agree with that, because let's think about a high school football team. If there was a freshman who made varsity and was an all-conference performer, and there was a senior who only made varsity a senior year and then made all-conference, which of the two of them would you project to have a better career? You probably project the freshman, because he's doing it against guys who are older than him. And he still has a lot more. He still has 3 years to grow. So I look at so one of the things I look at is, how early did you break into the starting lineup, and did you show you could perform at a young age? Because the ceiling's higher. It doesn't always work out that way. Sometimes older prospects do succeed, and young prospects don't always succeed. But I actually think that that's an underrated way of looking at things. So I think Membu, that's an interesting aspect of his performance. I mean, I think that there are some question marks. Again, this is a guy we'll talk a lot more about in the days and weeks ahead. But I think that this is a kind of an intriguing. I think that the draft might be if the Jets are going to address the offensive line, the best way to do it would be through the draft. Now, that's not to say automatically that they should draft an offensive lineman, but I think in this day and age, it's tough to build an offensive line without investing heavily in the draft. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll turn our attention to the defensive side of the ball because there's also a pretty big question mark in the trenches there next to Quinnen Williams. The Jets have signed a couple of guys, but I don't know how helpful they'll be. What are the options for the Jets to upgrade their defensive tackle spot next to Quinnen Williams? We'll talk about that continuing here on this Thursday edition of Locked On Jets.
The NCAA tournament is here, and so is the Bracket Breakdown.
Locked On Podcast Network and Amazon Fire TV channels are teaming up to deliver NCAA tournament coverage like never before. Watch studio shows featuring former players and Locked On's local experts as they guide you through every upset, buzzer beater, and bracket matchup.
Stream it all for free on Amazon Fire TV channel. Search Bracket Breakdown to see it all for free.
It's your team every day.
This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Thursday. We're talking about remaining Jets needs this offseason. We're about a week and a half into free agency. The Jets have addressed some of their needs, but not all. And if we're being honest, the Jets probably are not going to be able to address every single need that they have this offseason. But there are some spots to prioritize, and we're discussing what those priority spots are. And I'm going to end the show by talking about defensive tackle. Now, the Jets have made a couple signings. I don't know how helpful these signings are. And, I think that the Jets at defensive tackle are in a spot where they're going to be okay as long as Quinnen Williams is healthy, because Quinnen Williams is a top-notch player. And despite what we saw last year with Javon Kinlaw and, Lecky Fatu, for the most part, if you put a semi-credible player next to Quinnen Williams, they'll be okay, because Quinnen Williams is going to draw so much attention. And even when Quinnen Williams draws a lot of attention, he's still able to execute at a high level. But I think it would be better to have a higher caliber player next to Quinnen Williams. Now, on the free agent markets, there really aren't that many big names. There's always like a veteran or two who's trying to like hold on to his career, who will be available after the draft. Maybe the Jets look at a Jonathan Hankins or look at bringing back a Foley Fatukasi. The one guy I mentioned yesterday, John Kaminsky, I think he could be a viable option for the Jets, a guy with experience in an Aaron Glenn defense. And, I do believe that when a new coaching staff comes in, there's value to having somebody who's worked in the system before, because there are lots of nuances whenever you're implementing a new scheme, a lot of depth to these plays. And I think having somebody with experience can kind of become an extension of the coaching staff. Kaminsky's a decent player. He's been a solid run stopper through his career, kind of an interior type defensive lineman. He's played with Aaron Glenn before, so naturally there's a fit. So he's a guy I'd keep my eye on. I think that there's a very real chance the Jets will bring him in. And then if you're talking about the draft, and look, I know I've mentioned the draft for wide receiver and offensive line, and the Jets can only address one of these three spots at 7. But the guy I've talked a lot about, who I think might be my number one choice, is Mason Graham. And it's not because I think defensive line or defensive tackle is the number one need for the Jets. It's just because I think Graham's a really good player. And if he's available there at 7, he'd be a guy that would really have my interest. And part of the reason I like Graham, and I always say I like Graham, but I don't really go into detail why I like him. I just view him as like a complete defensive lineman. I mean, I think we think of like two types of defensive tackles. We talk about the guy who can hold the point of attack, who can absorb the double team, and then we talk about a guy who can penetrate and get up the field. And I think Graham just like has the total package. I think he's strong enough that in situations where he is double teamed, he's going to hold up. He's not going to be Javon Kinlaw and get driven 5, 6, 7 yards down the field. He'll have the strength to absorb blocks and keep the linebackers clean. But when he gets one-on-ones, he's explosive. He's already got some developed moves. He's a guy who can make plays. And I think that pairing him next to Quinnen Williams would be a really powerful thing for the Jets, because when they're both on the field, you can only double team one of the two of them. Right now, Quinnen Williams is the guy who has most double teams directed at him, because whoever's been lining up next to him hasn't been as dynamic of a threat. And somebody, if you have to double team one guy, it's going to be Quinnen Williams, and you'll single block the other guy. That becomes a lot tougher when Mason Graham's in the mix. Another aspect of this I like is that defensive tackles don't play the full game. They need rest. It's a very tiring spot to play. So I also like the idea that at any given point in time, you will always have either Quinnen Williams or Mason Graham on the field together, if not both. And I've talked a lot about how I think that the age gap between Williams and Graham is really good, because right now Quinnen's in his prime, so Graham can kind of develop And when the point where Graham's entering his prime, Quinnen might be on the downside of his career. And he might, Quinnen Williams, you might want him as your number 2 defensive tackle, and he'll be able to slide into that role. I think if the Jets are going to address this in a big way, though, it's going to have to be through the draft. I think there are some decent players like Kaminsky who could come in and, fill a rotational role. But I think that if you're going to address this in a major way, if you're going to, go out and get a top-notch tackle, it's probably going to have to be through the draft. And that's just true in general. In the NFL, there aren't a ton of impact players available in free agency. Free agency is a good spot to fill holes with quality players. Sometimes if you're a really smart front office, you can identify guys who fit your system better than they fit their previous system, or you can identify ascending players that maybe there's reason to believe that their trajectory is on a good path and that they're going to improve going forward. You can get them at a good discount deal. But for the most part, the real difference makers are either drafted or acquired in trades. If you draft a guy, you can get him on a reasonable rookie contract. But if you have a legitimate impact player and you don't think you're going to be able to re-sign him, usually you trade him before his contract expires, so that way you get something in return instead of letting him walk in free agency for nothing. So free agency is a really tough way to build your team. I mean, obviously there's a component of free agency in successful team building, but really, if you're going to get impact players, it has to be through the draft, and you only get one first-round pick a year. So I've laid out 3 positions where the Jets need to upgrade, and obviously with their first round pick, they can only address one of them, and the others, well, they'll have to figure out a way to address the others. And maybe it's some of the guys I've mentioned. Maybe there's like a lower level guy. Maybe there's somebody under the radar. Maybe there's a cap cut coming from another team that can help them address these. But the point is that none of this is going to be easy for the Jets. It's going to be a bit of a challenge, and if they are able to address multiple spots here, then we will know that the front office has done a good job. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoyed the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and you're listening on a podcast source, please give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your Thursday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.